honor, courage, loyalty, and compassion. These were the obligations of the medieval knights. The ideal concept of a medieval knight came about in 800 AD, during the rule of Charlemagne. At that time, the cavalry was one of the most powerful combat forces in the main European battlefields. Having a horse was not enough to be part of the cavalry. Horse and knight had to do many hours of hard training in order to prepare themselves for the several situations that could occur in battle. These brave warriors had the mission of knocking down enemy lines, protecting the flanks of their army, and fighting other knights. During the Crusades, the knights played a fundamental role, and many participated in the battles for the control of the Holy Land. The reasons that led the knights to participate in the Crusades were several: religious fervor, ambition to conquer new lands and titles, or plunder cities. Over time, many of these knights gained fame and wealth for their heroic acts. They won noble titles and were presented with fertile land that they could cultivate and prosper. Many knights became incredibly rich and often lent money to the kings they served. The more fortunate became lords and employed other knights. To secure the longevity of their conquests, these lords permitted peasants to reside on their land, provided they worked and paid taxes. Thus, many private territories emerged. These territories became known as fiefdoms, and the richest were owners of villages, churches, and even castles. To keep their land safe, they hired men to serve as guards. Some had battalions of soldiers under their command. The children of these feudal lords were trained and educated from infancy to be able to fight and command. However, the eldest son rarely participated in the battles. The firstborn son and heir was often a tactical commander during wars. Only nobility knights and their children could belong to the royal cavalry. Therefore, being a knight was a hereditary title and a symbol of wealth and authority. The knights also had the ambition to marry women from other noble families or even royalty in order to strengthen their own lineage. Even with this power, the medieval knights still owed allegiance to the king, serving as vassals and taking an oath to him. To break an oath or not to respect the military summons was an act of betrayal. It could have serious consequences, such as the annulment of the titles won, the loss of the right to land, and even death. In case of war, the lords were summoned by the king. These, in turn, were to summon the knights and other men who lived on their lands. The first plate armor appeared in the 13th century. It was perfected and improved in the following 400 years. The armor of the medieval knights changed forever the history of the wars. Many of them were works of art, tailor-made for the user's body. These armors were excellent, but they were made up of many different pieces, attached by leather straps. The help of a squire was needed to put it on. Medieval knights wore robes of various colors over their armor and horses. These tunics also had the family coat of arms, or the lord's. The tunics also protected the armor from heat or cold, preserving the metal. With this new model of armor, medieval knights were more prominent on the battlefields. In most cases, the armor allowed the knights to stop using the shields. Their focus became only the attacking maneuvers. Although the longsword was one of the most iconic symbols of medieval knights, it was not a particularly effective weapon against armor. Contrary to what is portrayed in movies and games, the swords could not cut the armor. They were most useful when used with one hand holding the blade in a technique known as the half sword. The goal was to reach the weak points of the armor. The most effective weapons against the armor of medieval knights were halberds and war hammers. They were heavy weapons and had a strong impact to knead or pierce armor. Many knights decorated their helmets with colored feathers or figures of animals and mythological beings. The goal was to differentiate themselves and show that they did not hide during battle. This proof of self-confidence terrorized low-ranked enemy soldiers, who also had fewer protections to fight with. The advantage of a medieval knight over an infantryman was disproportionate. As a result, many soldiers fled in panic when they had to face the cavalry. However, the knights were not invincible. A determined group of soldiers could surround the knight and overthrow him, putting an end to his noble existence. Due to the high cost of keeping horses, armor, weapons, and servants, it was practically impossible for someone not noble to become a knight. The training of a medieval knight began as a child. At the age of 7, he should begin his studies, learning to read and write. He should also learn good manners and the history of his family. At the age of 14, they began physical training, learning to ride horses, to use various weapons such as swords. At the age of 17, the young aspirant would become a squire. As a squire, he served an experienced knight. He helped the knight to wear armor, besides learning about battle tactics and training in physical conditioning. In times of war, the squires had to follow the knights to the place of battle. There, they waited in the camp or saw the battle at a certain distance. If the war was too long, the squires were forced to go to the battlefields, serving water, food, while replacing horses and weapons. In some cases, they fought together with the knight, protecting his rear guard. Around the age of 20, the squire could receive the title of knight if he were considered worthy of that honor. During the ceremony, the squire was to spend 24 hours in prayer in a church. Then he would cut his hair and bathe to be presentable in his oath. The young squire had to swear to protect women and the weakest, defend justice, love his homeland, and defend the church with his own life if necessary. This oath was the most important part of the cavalry code. After the oath, the squire knelt down. He received the blessing of the sword, becoming a legitimate knight at the service of the crown. In 1337, the 100 Years' War began between England and France, two of the greatest military powers of that time. During this war, the knights took on the role of war tanks on the battlefield, with heavy cavalry offensives and with long spears capable of hitting the enemy at an enormous distance. During that war, the terrible Battle of Agincourt took place. In this battle, the British were commanded by King Henry V and, even facing a French army 3 times larger, managed to win. The powerful and numerous French cavalry suffered a humiliating defeat before the English archers. When they were not at war, the knights participated in tournaments organized by nobles or kings. In these tournaments, blunt weapons were used. Still, many knights were injured in the fights. The jousting games were the noblest part of tournaments. They had the most valuable prizes and were the most proof of the courage of the medieval knights. During the jousting, a knight used an edgeless spear and galloped at high speed with the objective of hitting and knocking down his opponent. It was necessary to have nerves of steel to remain firm on the horse without running away from the spear that was coming in his direction at almost 80 kilometers per hour. The image of the knight in his shining armor gave rise to many stories and romantic tales during the medieval era. One of the best-known legends is that of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and despite being a legend before the medieval period, it was adapted to the literature of that time. With the arrival of more powerful firearms at the end of the 16th century, the knights slowly became obsolete. With such weapons, a peasant with only a few months of training could bring down a trained and fully equipped knight. Many knights became commanders on the battlefield, thus stopping to expose themselves to firearms. The armor continued to be worn for a long time, and it was more common to wear only the part that protected the torso. The era of the mighty medieval knights had come to an end. But the ideal of the noble knight, protector of peace and justice, will live forever in our history.